On July 30th, 1945, in the South Pacific, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Within 12 minutes, in an inferno of heavy smoke and blazing fury, she sank. Of the nearly 1,200 men on board, perhaps 800 went overboard, most of them without life jackets or any means of survival. Life jackets. Forgive me, most of them without life rafts or any means of survival except keep-out life jackets. The first torpedo hit the radio shack, so no distress signal went out. And due to a fantastic combination of errors and secrecy regulations, the Navy did not know that the Indianapolis was missing. On August 2nd, a Lockheed Ventura land plane, piloted by Wilbur Gwynn, was on a patrol flight searching for Japanese submarines. Flying at 10,000 feet, he spotted an oil slick. Thinking it might be a sub, he dropped to a low altitude and prepared to make a bomb run over the area, dropping depth charges. At the last instant, he realized that there were men floating in the water. He radioed his findings to his base. However, his trailing antenna was tangled and fouled, and the garbled message was interpreted to read that he had sighted a life raft. Lieutenant Adrian Marks was ordered to proceed to the location in his amphibious PBY Catalina and to drop survival gear. What he found was the greatest naval disaster in American history. Landing a seaplane on the rolling waves of the open sea is extremely hazardous, and taking off is virtually impossible. Such landings were, therefore, forbidden. However, when Lieutenant Marks saw literally hundreds of men in the water below him, he was unable to turn and fly away from them. Knowing that he would be subject to court-martial for landing, and that he might destroy his aircraft, he nonetheless radioed his findings, his position, and his intentions, and made a very rough but survivable landing. He and his crew pulled 56 of the survivors out of the water, still a record for the most survivors ever rescued by a single airplane. These 56, at least, were safe from the elements and the feasting sharks during the 5th night since their ship had been sunk. Others in the water were not so lucky. Rescue ships, summoned by Lieutenant Marks, arrived the following day. Of the 1,200 men who had been aboard the Indianapolis, 880 perished. Only 316 survived. The survivors of this tragedy, fewer each year, meet in reunion every 5th year in this city. In 1985, they observed the 40th anniversary of their rescue. Commander Marks, now a semi-retired attorney living in Frankfort, Indiana, addressed the group with a speech titled, "I've Seen Greatness." He has been asked to repeat this speech many times. Tonight, he has honored us by agreeing to deliver it one more time. To deliver the speech is being professionally videotaped, and copies will be available. He will deliver the talk exactly as it was given to the survivors in 1985. He will address you as if you were the survivors of the USS Indianapolis. Lieutenant Marks will speak from his seated position at the table. I hope you all can see. And it's going to take a moment to make some...
I met you 40 years ago. I met you on a sparkling, sun-swept afternoon of horror. I have known you through a balmy tropic night of fear. I will never forget you. I suppose that through the years which have so swiftly run, at least 10,000 times, I have recalled some portion of the day when our fates were crossed. But the memories which surface in my retrospection are not of horror, not of blackness, not of fear. I think of little things, of things as small as courage, honor, and a simple honesty. Things so small and yet so great that they form the cornerstone of our society. And when I think about these little things, I am humbled by the thought that I have seen true greatness in my time. Some of my reflections have been so astonishing as to make me think of miracles. Sometimes we say that we are living in a world of miracles. Things beyond the wildest imagination of our forefathers are now everyday experiences. We sit in our living rooms and watch events occurring half a world away. We bounce our messages off artificial moons which hang stationary in the sky. The computer which sits alongside my desk is a never-ending source of astounding revelations to me. These miracles I have learned to accept and even to understand. But there is one miracle which is beyond all of my powers of understanding. It is the miracle that you are here today and not with your shipmates at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. What were the chances that you would be found? They were so minute as to be unbelievable. I flew many air-sea rescue missions, and I flew training missions where I searched for men who were deliberately placed out in the water to test various survival techniques. It was axiomatic that you could never find a lone man floating in the ocean. He could only be seen if he had some sort of survival aid. The best aid was a mirror. A mirror catching the sun and flashing in the pilot's eye was like the flash of a diamond. A package of dye marker made a great colorful glob on the surface of the water, which often could be found. The yellow color of a life raft was distinctive, and many times I went diving down in pursuit of a big yellow object, only to find that it was a cardboard box which had come unglued and was floating spread out flat upon the ocean. But you had none of these aids. You were simply out there, unknown and unmissed, floating in the dull gray life jacket which blended into the color of the water. A man's head is about 6 inches wide and 9 inches tall. If a pilot is flying a search mission, such as Wilbur Gwynn was flying, at 10,000 feet, looking down an angle of 30 degrees, what will he see? He will be looking down an angle at the water about 4 miles ahead. The span of his vision will be about 5 miles. He will see 20 square miles at a glance. How apparent will be the head of this man floating in the water? It will be about the diameter of the cross-section of a human hair seen endwise across the room. It will be lost in the countless waves and whitecaps of the ocean. He simply won't be seen. And even if the pilot knew that somewhere out there a man was swimming, how could he search? I turned to my computer. There are 6,080 feet in a nautical mile. There are 36,966,400 square feet in 1 square mile. 750 million square feet in 120 square mile glance. And a floating man will occupy less than 1 square foot of that space. A search mission went out 600 miles. The air crew was supposed to make a visual search of 10 miles on each side of this track. A radar search, such as Wilbur Gwynn was making, would be much wider. I typed these figures into my computer. 600 miles by 20 miles, 12,000 square miles on each pass. And it would take 5 passes to visually search a 100 miles wide strip. Multiply these figures. The computer overloads and goes into scientific notation. It can only write the figures in terms of exponents, and the very first exponent goes to the 12th power. Even the national debt starts to look small. A pilot and his air crew normally look out at an angle at the water. They search the water for ships and the sky for aircraft. And the pilot won't see a man swimming in the water unless he happens to look right straight down on him. The only way you could be seen was for someone to look straight down on you. The only way a pilot can look straight down is to make a very steep bank turn or to execute a dive bombing maneuver. And what pilot would do a silly thing like that in the forlorn and empty stretch of ocean where you were swimming? What were the chances of that? What were the chances that Wilbur Gwynn would fly a course which would take him directly over you? What were the chances that his radio antenna would break while he was out on this mission? What were the chances that he would open his bomb bay door and look straight down momentarily? And what were the chances that he would look straight down at one of you? You didn't have a chance in a million. I know that most of you prayed a lot, and I know that some of you feel that it made a difference. Wilbur Gwynn is a wonderful man and a fine pilot. He never said that he heard a voice speak to him. But was there an unseen hand upon his shoulder? Did he find you by pure chance? The odds against it are 1 in a million. Nay, 1 in a billion. But somehow he was chosen as the instrument to overcome these impossible astronomical odds. Wilbur Gwynn looked down at the split second that would become one of the great moments of history. I, as well as you, am proud to know him as a friend. And I am sorry to say that Wilbur did pass away a few months ago. Any sensible person knows that no one can swim for 4.5 days. And yet, you did. For 40 years, I have reflected upon the blind courage and the unbelievable greatness of spirit that I saw when each survivor was brought aboard my airplane. And I have been compelled by the evidence of my own eyes to believe in miracles. But I have digressed. I cannot explain miracles, but I can only tell you about some of the little things that I remember from 40 years ago. And when I think about these little things, I realize that I have seen true greatness in my time. Let me share with you my memories. I am sitting in the wardroom of the Doyle. It is all over, and we are heading back to Peleliu. Over on the wardroom transom, the bravest man I ever knew is crying. And between sobs he talks in a voice so hoarse from exposure that it croaks and rasps and breaks. Lieutenant Commander Lewis L. Haynes, senior medical officer of the USS Indianapolis, has awakened after a few hours of sleep, and with a sudden release of emotion and nervous tension, is off on a talking jag. Doctor, why don't you rest? Your voice is almost gone. You can tell about it tomorrow. But he will not be stilled. Exhausted, dehydrated, sleepless, and shaking with fever, he talks on. For before he can find rest, his story must be told in all its tragic detail. Dr. Haynes and I are both newcomers to the Doyle. We have both come aboard in mid-ocean. Early that morning, I had climbed to the bridge and flung a swift salute to the captain. Sir, I request that you destroy my airplane by gunfire. And then I had stood silently while the airplane which had rescued 56 of you burst into flames. Why didn't they know we were missing? Why weren't they looking for us? Why? The voice rasped on and on. I could not answer. I cannot yet. 25 years ago, I was intrigued by Captain McVeigh's commentary upon the book, The Caine Mutiny. He said, I've known men like those characters. Almost every one of them reminds me of someone I have encountered during my career. But not all on one ship, and not all at one time. Likewise, he continued, he had known some monumental foul-ups in the Navy. There were cases of mistake, of negligence, of equipment and communication failure. But what malevolent fate caused them to all befall one ship at one time? It was late the next day that I sat in the warm wardroom of the Doyle, feeling the throb of the screws pushing us back to Peleliu. Down in the cruise compartment, the 56 survivors from my airplane, together with 37 more of the Doyle that the Doyle's crew had fished out of the water, were being tenderly cared for. Every member of the ship's company had become a hospital corpsman and had been assigned primary responsibility for the survivor who occupied his bunk. During every off-watch hour, each crewman sat beside his patient, bathed him, brought him water, summoned the doctor if necessary, and felt the thrill of seeing the transformation that a few hours of water, rest, and care could work. Up in the wardroom, we had our survivor too. Before Dr. Haynes awakened, I had been sitting at the wardroom table, writing my official report of the operation and reviewing with my co-pilots the many fateful decisions we had made during the past 24 hours. Most of our decisions, I felt, were right. We had broken communications security, but we had stirred up action. We had landed in the open sea, which was a violation of standing orders. But our landing had been successful. We had destroyed our airplane, and no one would ever question its expenditure. But now I had made certain decisions which now were beginning to haunt me. When we landed, we realized that we couldn't rescue everyone. We would have to make heartbreaking decisions. We would have to pick and choose among those of the survivors. From the air, we noticed that most of them were clustered into groups of 10 or more men, clinging together. But outside these groups were many isolated swimmers, floating in their life jackets. Most of them were seemingly alive, but some were obviously already dead, including those whom we had seen being molested by sharks. I decided that the men in groups stood the best chance of survival. They could look after one another, could splash and scare away the sharks, and could lend one another moral support and encouragement. But the single swimmers had no one else to turn to, and without the support of comrades, were the most likely to succumb to the despair of the night. Of course, I had no idea that you had been in the water for 4.5 days. I therefore decided that we would concentrate on picking up the single swimmers, and the groups would have to wait for other rescue. But now that I realized the full gravity of the men's condition, I was beginning to doubt the wisdom of my decision. Could I ever be forgiven for passing any of these men by? Dr. Haynes had been with one of the largest groups of survivors. They had no raft, but the doctor had organized them to look after one another, and for day after day had ministered to the injured, the demented, and the dying. Finally, after 4 long days of torment, he had seen my airplane land and slowly taxi toward them. And then, as we came near, he and his fellows had waved and screamed and cheered, and we had waved in recognition, and then deliberately passed them by. It was simply incomprehensible. They shouted and shook their fists and wept tears of black despair. And although they knew that they had been seen, the airplane never returned, and they were left to shiver through yet a fifth night until near morning, when the Doyle's boat finally found them. Now, as I listen to Dr. Haynes recount the tragedies of his first-hand experience, the responsibility for my decision to pick up the singles first was weighing heavily upon me, and I feared that I had been wrong. True, we had rescued 56 men, but when darkness stopped our rescue operation, there was still room left on our airplane's broad wings. Maybe if I had gone after the groups, I would have been able to take more men aboard in the time available to me. As I listened to Dr. Haynes, I could imagine how bitter must have been his disappointment to see me turn and deliberately taxi away. With great misgiving, I told Dr. Haynes the reason for my decision. I asked, had I made a horrible error? Should I have taken your men aboard? I think it is a measure of the character of Dr. Haynes that in a voice that was scarcely more than a whisper, he rasped out, "Lieutenant, you were right. You did right to pass us by." We have all heard how on occasions of great emergency or crisis, individuals have sometimes summoned up almost superhuman strength. It happened on our airplane. My navigator, Ensign Morgan Hensley, wasn't a particularly big man, but he had been an amateur wrestler in high school and college, and he was very well muscled. After we landed, my co-pilot and I taxied the airplane, and Morgan was in charge of fishing survivors out of the water and bringing them aboard. We would taxi toward a survivor, and then the loading party would throw him a life ring attached to a line, and when he grabbed the ring, they would haul him aboard. One of the survivors slipped out of his life jacket when we threw him the ring, and then he missed grabbing the ring. We were closing rapidly on him, but it was obvious that if we missed him on the first pass, he would never have the strength to survive while we came about for a second try. Morgan was standing in the port blister, and as the man passed under it, he reached down, grabbed the man under the armpits, and then straightened up in one movement, lifting the man out of the water and pitching him over his head into the airplane. If you would like to duplicate this maneuver, try standing on a rather high chair, then reach down and grab someone lying on the floor beneath you and try lifting them up. Morgan said later that he didn't know where he got the strength to do it. I don't know either, but then I don't know where men got the strength to swim for 4.5 days. I have known greatness in my time. When I landed my airplane, you had been swimming for 87 hours. Our airplane carried 4 water breakers containing 4.5 gallons of fresh water each. Before the day ended, we were to take aboard so many men that this supply would figure only a little more than a quart each. As each exhausted survivor was hauled aboard, he was given half a cup of water. Then in 3 or 4 minutes, when his stomach had settled, he received half a cup more. Doubtless, the first men rescued received a somewhat larger share of our supply than those rescued later. But after the first 2 drinks, they usually collapsed into a deep sleep from which they only fitfully awakened to cry of thirst. As the afternoon wore on, the hull of the old PBY was filled to capacity. There were 2 men in each bunk. We tried to sit them on the floor, but they collapsed to lie 2 and 3 deep in every compartment of the airplane. It became absolutely impossible to walk through the airplane, and still each few minutes another desperately exhausted and ill survivor was being brought aboard. Finally, I shut off the engines, and we started hauling men out on the wing. They were too exhausted to help themselves, and trying to balance ourselves on the bobbing airplane and pass these badly burned and helpless men up to the wing was a difficult and sometimes dreadfully painful maneuver. But there wasn't any place else to put them. The wing, while broad enough, had a decided slant toward the stern, so that it was necessary that each man be secured with a piece of parachute shroud line to prevent him from sliding off. Darkness comes quickly in the tropics, and with the night we streamed a sea anchor from the bow and drifted. I had hoped to use our landing lights and an Aldous lamp as a searchlight to continue our search for survivors, but we quickly found that plan to be impractical. An inventory disclosed that there was still some water left in one of the water breakers in the radio compartment. This water was passed up in a kettle, and someone groped his way through the darkness down the wings, giving each man half a cup. There never was very much water in the kettle because it trickled slowly from the spigot, and we didn't want to risk spilling a drop as we crawled along the wing of the pitching airplane. So after 4 or 5 men had received their water ration, we crawled back to return the empty kettle and receive another with a few cups of water sloshing around in the bottom. Then we crawled back out the wing and tried to determine where we had left off. And as we passed these exhausted and dehydrated survivors, voice after voice in the darkness would say, "I've had mine." And that way we would find where we had left off and go on down the wing with our ration of water. Fortunately, the water lasted until we had delivered 2 rations down each wing, and although the men were still burning of thirst, no one ever took or asked an extra ration. I'm sure that the ladies who are here realize that they married some extra special husbands, but I wonder if they know that they were that honest. I get a warm glow of satisfaction whenever I think of this incident. Conduct like that is not indoctrinated through military training. It is learned at an early age in Sunday school and in a home where honesty is a way of life. In an operation where so many things went wrong, where so many people didn't get the word, and where those who did it who did get it failed to appreciate the situation. The perception of Lieutenant Commander W. Graham Claytor, in command of the Doyle, was a shining exception. As he streamed through the gathering dusk, still more than 100 miles away, he intercepted the radio conversation between me and the Ventura search plane. He knew that there might be enemy submarines ahead because I had warned him of them. And he didn't know what sort of situation he was heading into, but he had the perception to know that somewhere up ahead, men were clinging to life with their last ounce of strength, and that with darkness came cold loneliness and despair. It is in the hours of darkness that most men give up the fight, and he felt that if there was something that he could do to give these men hope, to let them know that help was on the way, maybe they would summon the courage and the strength to hang on a few hours more. I will never forget how dark were the early hours of that night. There was no moon, and the starlight was obscured by clouds. And even though we were near the equator, the wind whipped up and it was cold. We had long since dispensed the last drop of water, and scores of badly injured men, stacked 3 deep in the fuselage and ranged far out on both wings, were softly crying with thirst and with pain. And then, far out on the horizon, there was a light. No matter the warning of submarines, no matter the unknown dangers of the night, the USS Doyle turned on her big 24-inch searchlight and pointed it straight up to reflect off the bottom of the clouds 2,000 feet up in the sky. And it stayed on. For hour after hour, it shone as a beacon of hope in the sky. The results on our own plane were electrifying. To the men who cried for water, we would say, "Look, see that light? It's a destroyer on its way. There's water and doctors and rescue coming soon." And men would settle back in hope to gaze upon that lovely light. And out around us, where men were struggling to survive their 5th night in the water, there were scores of you who saw the light and summoned up that one last ounce of strength to last till rescue came. Turning on that light took courage. It took the courage of one man. It took the courage that is the Navy. I've seen greatness in my time, not that of some politician or popular hero, but the greatness of the entire crew of a great ship. And while that crew will always be something very special to me, I know that it was drawn at random from among the servicemen of our country. I have seen the greatness of America. I think I'd better yell. I'll be back.
Here, I'm going to ask Jim O'Donnell to come to the microphone. Jim was a survivor of the USS Indianapolis. Is there another survivor here tonight? Someone said there is. Would you stand? Another survivor of the USS Indianapolis? Because I was misinformed. Jim is, I understand, was in the water but some distance. His group had floated away, and he never did see the PBY. But he had some experiences of his own. Jim, if you'd like to either tell him about it or
If there's any questions they want to ask about it, I'd be happy.
Jim said, why don't you just ask him some questions and he'll answer them.
Does anybody have any questions that they would like to know about that?
How long were you in the water before you were picked up?
Almost 5 days. The airplane that they're talking about, the Lieutenant Marks flew and landed, I did not see it because we had been spread out over a number of miles. As a matter of fact, the last ships that searched a 200 square mile area. So we had spread out quite a bit.
Jim, would you repeat the questions for me?
What was the weather like those 4 or 5 days?
What was the weather like? Well, it was awful warm in the daytime. At night, probably get down to 9 degrees. It was cold.
Did you have more than just a life jacket?
No, sir, I had a K-Pop life jacket on.
Did you see the searchlight? Did you see the light?
I don't remember seeing it.
What were what was the physical condition of those around you? Do you remember
The
what they were
physical
like?
condition of most of us around, well, all of us were worn out, completely worn out. And,
Conscious and
well,
talking?
some conscious, some not. I think you drowsed off to sleep a lot. And it was just one of those things that you just don't know really what you did all the time.
Did you hang together with the group?
Did you hang together with a group? Yes, sir, I was with a group.
Did you tie yourself together or hold hands?
No, we didn't just stick together, just in a circle.
Do you believe that being together with the group was more of an advantage for you to survive than if you were floating by yourself?
If you were with the group, was it a better advantage? Yes, sir, it was, because it seemed like that most of the sharks picked off the singles.
What time of day did the plane hit the water? The airplane landed at what time of day or night?
What time did the airplane land? I couldn't tell you. It was, well, let's see, it must have been late in the afternoon, because I think Gwen spotted us sometime around noon or so.
Did you see Gwen? The dive bomb?
No, I did not. Didn't.
How were you picked up personally?
How was I picked up? Well, I was picked up by the USS Bassett, and they had some Higgins boats. It was an attack transport, and they had some, seemed like I'm getting steady. They had some Higgins boats out there, and a couple guys just reached over and plucked me out of the water.
Was there any particular one thing that you thought of all the time you were in the water that kind of helped you get through it?
Was there anything I thought of? Well, you just can't give up, honey. You think of a lot of things and you pray an awful lot.
You said the K-Pop life preservers, the ones that I'm familiar with, after a couple of days in the water, they sink. They take on water. How did you?
K-Pop life jacket after a couple of days sinks. Well, don't believe that. They were still floating.
5 days and still floating.
Yes, sir. That's what I had on. How's the memorial coming? Well, the basics are pretty well set, and we are right now and probably need $130,000-$140,000 to get the granite that the ship and farm of the ship is going to be made out of, and everything, where they're going to, as I understand, put the, well, we have a meeting coming up next month, and there's going to be more about it then, but I think all the names are going to be on there, some designations of who did and who didn't, and things like that. It's got a little bit more decision yet.
What was your duty on the ship?
What was my duty? Well, I was a water tender at the time, which is a rank they don't have anymore, I understand. I was down in the fire room where you made the steam for the turbines. And that time it's all low pressure steam. We only had 300 pound steam, that's what it was. Now it's, I think, 600 to more.
During the time you were in the water 5 days, how much weight do you think you lost at that time?
How much weight did I lose? Well, I don't know. Probably lost a little bit, but I was still pretty heavy, and I still am. Far back. Where was I when the torpedoes hit? Well, at the time that the torpedoes hit, I was sleeping with a couple other fellas that was to go on watch. We were to go on watch at 4 o'clock in the morning. And we were sleeping right by the number 3 turret. What your number 3 turret is on the aft of the ship. And most of the time you usually slept in a group, so the guy coming to call the watch wouldn't have to go all over. So
You sometimes wake up at night time and think you're still there.
do I sometimes wake up and think I'm still there? No, sir. If it hadn't have been for this memorial being built, you'd never hear me talk about it.
Indianapolis delivered some of the parts to the nuclear bomb, did they not?
Did the Indianapolis deliver the nuclear bombs?
Well, parts of it.
Yes, they did. They delivered both bombs to
You
10.
were ordered to go down to the Philippines, as I understand it. Was that correct? Or down that way? Why? How come the Navy didn't know where you were? And I heard something about zigzagging. You know, I don't know.
Well, you want to get into a phase of it that I don't even care to talk about, but we did deliver the bombs to Tinian. That's where the bombs were flown off of. And we were on our way to Leyte in the Philippines for gunnery practice for the invasion of Japan. We were sunk on the way there. We were not running a zigzag course because it is the discretion of the captain as to whether you need to or not. At the trial, the captain of the submarine said that it wouldn't have made any difference whether we were or not, and we had captains of our submarines that were there, and they said it wouldn't have made any difference. Once we spotted you, all we'd had to do is change the little direction we'd had you. So it was one of those things.
2 more questions, please, and then we'll go to Mr. Marks.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I wonder about the severity of a sunburn. I know 5 hours in the sun weighs a number on me. I think of 5 days. Anybody sunburned?
How the sunburn was. Well, most of you were underwater, but still you got burnt, and from the water and the sun and everything, your skin did peel off. Couple more questions, and then we'll let Mr. Marks have it back, or is that it? Yes, sir.
How did the Navy treat U.S. survivors and as enlisted men after you were rescued?
Well, we were treated all right. I mean, there was nothing wrong that way. We were sent to a hospital. I went to Samar in the Philippines, and the other group went to Peleliu, and then we rejoined at Guam and stayed in the rest camp, the submarine rest camp there, until we got evacuation out. But normally you would get evacuation home right away after something like that. But the war was over, So they sent all the ships to Japan to bring the prisoners of war back. So we didn't get home. This happened in July. I got home in October. Well, I want to thank you people for allowing me to come tonight.
Thank you.
Sure. Sure, let them throw out questions on anything. Yes, sir.
Commander Marks, what was your squadron?
VP 23.
23, I was in 25. What were the sea conditions when you landed?
Extremely favorable. They were sufficiently favorable that I was able to land. The sea, there were almost no waves. There were, however, long swells. And actually what I did, I skimmed across the top of the swells. And it's been said, and I thought for a while that I had bounced. I really don't think I bounced much. I think what happened was I'd skim across the top and then the water would disappear beneath me. And then I'd hit the next swell and I'd cut through it. And then the third one, I had totally killed my lift, and I was able to settle down and stick. Yes, sir.
How many crew members on PBY?
We had a crew of 9. Pardon? Oh, yes, sir.
I thought the cruise and battleships were supposed to have destroyer escorts about all the time, weren't they? Why were they without an escort?
That is a very good question. And I think it was recently there's been a PBS show on the Indianapolis, which was the best presentation that I have seen yet on television. Some of the presentations have been horrible, but there was a rather fair presentation. The fact was that the ship was built during a period of international political negotiation, and she was originally supposed to be a battleship, and then they had to cut her back to a cruiser, and in the course of that they left some of the armor on the side, but the below water armor was omitted for weight considerations. So it was a political thing that happens, that our armed forces really are under the control of a president who is a very political animal. Yes?
Could you paint a visual picture or a word picture of what it was like when you, right after you landed? What did you see? What was going on around you?
I saw absolutely nothing. It was the most distressing thing. I had picked an area where I knew there were a lot of swimmers. And when I got down on the water, I looked up and all I could see was a wall of blue water. I couldn't see a thing. I'd come up on top of the swell, and for a minute I could see the next swell, but I had no altitude. I was down beneath the top of the swell almost all the time. But I did have eyes. I had that second Ventura, which was by the Ventura squadron commander, came out to leave, it was Gwynn, relieve him. Now, he was up there where he could see, just as I had been able to see before I landed. He could see that, he could see me. He couldn't land. He couldn't land and I couldn't see. But we both could talk and hear, and our radio reception was absolutely perfect through the whole thing. So he would say, okay, Marks, come right, steady as you go, Marks. Or he didn't say Marks, he said Dumbo. All PBYs were known as Dumbos back then, and I guess they still are. But he would guide me until all of a sudden we'd say, okay, we see him, and then we would taxi up, pitch the life ring, and haul him aboard, and then Atterbury would spot another one for us. Yes, sir.
Knowing you disobeyed orders, and how did the Navy powers that be handle the whole situation after it was all over and you got back to your base and spoke to your commanding officer?
Well, as far as I was concerned, I wasn't in on that. Now, a very, very close friend of mine, Captain Nakel, who was later commander of the Armory, told me some of the stories that he heard on Guam. You know, some of the best history comes out of a beer bottle. And some of those beer bottle yarns are what I plan on putting in my next book. Yes, sir?
You and Wilbur Gwynn ever meet personally?
Oh, yes, many times. We were very close friends, and I was most distressed at Wilbur's passing, and particularly the great courageous effort that he made to carry through the last survivors meeting when he was just being eaten up with disease.
Our local television had a news clip at the time of his death. That's how I learned about this story.
Wilbur Gwynn was a wonderful, very, very kind, and very thoughtful man. You couldn't have picked a nicer man to bestow the cloak of greatness on.
When did you first discover these men were survivors of the Indianapolis? I assume you had no idea that they were missing?
We discovered it when we fished the first one out of water. And that is a story in itself that I'm going to write up on one of the things that really concerned me was that I had the chutzpah to refuse to receive questions from Admiral Nimitz. He kept radioing questions to me, and I said, I know enough about communications, I know enough about security, that I know all I have is a little restricted aircraft code. It's not sufficiently secure to entrust this big a news to, because I don't want the Japanese to know that they got the Indianapolis, and I don't think Guam does either. But so what I did, I simply got real dumb. I refused to Roger for anything. I just refused to Roger. All of a sudden, my radio ceased to function.
Right here in front.
Were you able to bring anything from your aircraft, save any piece of it?
Well, I don't have anything of personally that in the way of souvenirs, but I did bring back a whole boatload of spare parts. Once we decided, once we got all the men off, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we got that old 2-cycle generator to start on the first pull. God was still with us. And we gave one pull and whoop, why she went. And we had lights again, we had electricity. So we made an inspection of the ship, of the plane, and we knew that it was damaged much too far to risk on a takeoff. There were holes in the wing. It was the biggest airplane that the Navy ever had that had fabric airfoils, both rudders and ailerons, and the trailing edge of the wing. And they did that because it was stronger at that time than aluminum. The old aluminum was soft, and in certain places they needed the strength that came from using fabric, and that had been torn to shreds when we had those men up on the wing. So once we decided we weren't going to take off, I said, okay, we can't bring her back, but there's one thing we can do now. We can just rip everything apart that we could possibly use for spare parts. Let's rip out all of the instruments. Let's take out the IFF gear. Let's take all the small radios. The big one we couldn't get a handle on. It was about 200-pounder. But we got all the small radios out. We got the, we didn't get the machine guns out, but we did get the small ones. And we got, well, we got enough that we filled a whole whale boat full of stuff with the, we had extra phones, which were in great demand. And if there had been any idea of criticizing us for not taking off, that boatload of stuff answered it for them, because they were just tickled to death. My skipper was just tickled to death that I'd had the foresight to strip that plane. Well, that was the only thing I figured that we could have used if we had brought her home. There would have been a couple of engines, and I wasn't willing to risk 9 men for a couple of engines. Yes, sir?
How much time elapsed between the time you got the 56 on board and when the ship arrived?
Well, we finished fishing men out about a half hour after sunset, which, you know, twilight on near the equator comes real fast. And then it was so dang dark. Although one of our crewmen did go out in a rubber boat and by ear located a man who was hollering and brought him in. And I don't know just who he was, but he did bring him in, and we had no room on the ship, so we just let him float in the rubber boat and tied him on, and he had the most comfortable bed of all.
There's another man right back here.
I received an air medal, and Gwynn received an air medal, and the rest of our crew, including our co-pilots, only got letters of commendation.
Any more questions? Oh, right here on your left.
After everyone got home safe, did you often wonder, how did we do it all? It just seems so incredible to me.
Well, as I say in my speech, it never got to me because I personally had not suffered pain and deprivation and horror, the men that I saw were all still living. True, they were in awful bad shape, but I was so pleased that I could rescue them. And no, I have thought and rethought that operation and thought, how could I have done it different? And I don't know. I think that I did all that I could, and I think that old PBY did all that she could, because during that whole operation, we never had a single equipment failure. Everything worked. The radios worked, the IFF worked, everything. There wasn't one bloop thing that I could have put on a gripe sheet if I had got it back.
Commander Marks, we appreciate your being with us tonight very much. Thank you.